Welcome to Stories TH. Before we dive into today's chilling story, don't forget to hit the like button if you enjoy eerie tales and subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling mysteries. Our story begins in a quiet village where a mother and her son move into an old, abandoned house. But something is not right. The boy starts pointing at the house and talking about hearing someone cry. Little does she know, this is only the beginning of uncovering a dark, haunting past. Watch until the end for the shocking revelation. The Silent Village. The arrival of Sarah. Sarah, a single mother, had been looking for a fresh start after the difficulties in her past. Leaving behind the noise and bustle of the city, she found herself drawn to a small, isolated village on the outskirts of nowhere. It was the perfect place to escape, or so she thought. She packed up her belongings, grabbed her 3-year-old son Billy, and moved into an old, dilapidated house at the edge of the village. The house was cheap, in dire need of repairs, but Sarah didn't mind. It offered the solitude she craved, and a chance to build a new life for herself and her son. Upon their arrival, the village appeared deceptively peaceful. The streets were quiet, with only the occasional sound of the wind rustling through the trees. The homes were spaced far apart, and the only real noise came from the birds and the occasional animal in the distance. The house Sarah had moved into was tucked away at the far end of a narrow, winding road. It looked abandoned, its windows boarded up and the garden overgrown with weeds. But Sarah saw potential in the house, a place to heal and rebuild her life. The first few days went by without incident. Sarah focused on unpacking, trying to make the house feel like home. Billy, as energetic as ever, ran around the house, playing with his toys and occasionally pointing at the walls, his small fingers tracing the cracks. It was clear the house had a history, but Sarah was not one to get caught up in old stories. After all, she was here to make a future, not dwell on the past. However, as the nights grew darker, Sarah began to notice things she couldn't quite explain. At first, it was subtle, strange creaks in the floorboards, faint scratching noises in the walls, and a constant rustling outside her window. Sarah told herself it was nothing. The house was old, after all. But as the days turned into weeks, the noises grew louder, more distinct, and unsettling. One particularly stormy evening, as Sarah sat on the couch, she heard a sound that sent chills down her spine. A faint wail echoed from somewhere deep within the house, as if it were coming from the walls themselves. Sarah stiffened, her heart pounding in her chest. She walked cautiously through the house, checking the windows and doors, but found nothing. The house seemed still, almost too still. She shook it off, telling herself it was just the wind. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was off. The growing fear. As the days passed, Billy began to act strangely. At first, it was just small things. He would stare at the walls for long periods, his eyes fixed on something Sarah couldn't see. But then it got worse. Billy would often stand by the window, peering out into the night, murmuring words she couldn't quite make out. His once cheerful demeanor had changed into something more distant and withdrawn. Sarah tried to ask him what was wrong, but he only replied with incoherent phrases that made no sense to her. One evening, while Sarah was preparing dinner, she overheard Billy talking to himself in the living room. His voice was soft, almost as if he were speaking to someone invisible. "She's crying, Mommy," he whispered. Sarah froze, the knife in her hand slipping from her fingers. She turned around slowly to face her son, her heart sinking in her chest. "What did you say, Billy?" she asked, her voice trembling. Billy, his eyes wide and filled with fear, pointed toward the abandoned house at the end of the road. "She's crying," he repeated, his voice barely audible. "She's so cold." Sarah's blood ran cold as she stared at her son. What could he possibly know about the house? She had never spoken to him about it, nor had she mentioned the strange noises or the eerie presence she had felt since moving in. But here Billy was speaking of a woman crying from that very house. She tried to calm him down, brushing it off as a child's imagination, but deep inside, a knot of fear tightened in her stomach. She hadn't told him anything about the house, so how could he know? Sarah spent the rest of the evening trying to keep Billy distracted, but the unease lingered. That night, as she tucked Billy into bed. She kissed his forehead, still haunted by his words. "She's crying, Mommy," he repeated, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next day, Billy's strange behavior continued. He no longer laughed or played with his toys. Instead, he spent long hours staring out of the window, his expression distant and vacant. When Sarah tried to get him to engage in anything, he would only mutter, "She's sad." It became clear to Sarah that something was deeply troubling her son, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to find out what was happening. Whispers in the dark, the unseen presence. Desperate for answers, Sarah sought out the village's oldest residents. Among them was Mrs. Margaret, a woman in her 80s who had lived in the village her entire life. Mrs. Margaret was known to be a font of knowledge when it came to the village's history, and Sarah hoped she could provide some insight into what was happening in her home. One evening, Sarah sat down with Mrs. Margaret over a cup of tea, listening intently as the old woman began to speak of the house at the end of the road. "That house," Mrs. Margaret began, her voice low and tinged with caution, "used to belong to a family, the Edwards. Edward and his wife, Isabella, and their little girl, Sophia. They were well-liked, but one day they just disappeared. No one ever saw them again. Just vanished without a trace." Sarah listened, her heart pounding as Mrs. Margaret continued. "Some people say they heard strange sounds coming from the house, wailing, crying in the dead of night. And after they disappeared, the house was abandoned. The cries continued, echoing through the walls, but no one dared to go inside. There were rumors, of course, that they were taken by something unnatural." Sarah felt a shiver crawl down her spine. She had heard these rumors before, but dismissed them as village gossip. Now, hearing the story from someone so respected in the village, it felt real. Too real. Mrs. Margaret paused for a moment, eyeing Sarah closely. "You must be careful, dear. Some things are better left undisturbed." Sarah nodded, her mind racing with thoughts of her son. Could Billy be hearing these cries? Was he somehow connected to the tragic history of the house? The idea seemed far-fetched, but she couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that had begun to seep into her bones. The strange happenings, the wails, Billy's strange behavior, it all seemed to point back to that one house. Later that evening, as Sarah lay in bed, she couldn't help but think about what Mrs. Margaret had said. The idea that the house was haunted, that it had a dark history, felt impossible, but the events surrounding her son made it hard to ignore. She had to know more. But how? The child's warning. As the days passed, Billy's behavior grew even more erratic. He would no longer play outside, refusing to leave the house, and when he did venture into the yard, he would stand by the window, staring into the darkness, whispering, "She's crying." One night, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She had to see the house for herself. If something was truly wrong, she needed to know. She couldn't live in fear, unable to protect her son from whatever was tormenting him. So, with trembling hands, she grabbed her coat and stepped out into the cold, dark night. The wind howled as she made her way down the narrow road, her footsteps echoing in the silence. When she reached the house, she hesitated. The air felt thick with unease. There was no sound, no movement, but something in the air made her heart race. Sarah stood in front of the house for a long moment, staring up at the decaying structure. She could feel a presence, something watching her from the shadows. She stepped closer, her hand outstretched toward the door, but as she did, she felt a chill grip her spine. She froze, feeling as though something was standing just behind her, close enough to touch. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end, and she quickly turned around, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, only darkness. Her breathing quickened as a sudden rush of fear flooded her chest. She turned back to the house, and in that instant, she could have sworn she saw a figure move across the upstairs window. A fleeting shadow. Her pulse quickened, and her legs felt weak beneath her. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her. "Billy, I have to protect Billy," she whispered to herself, backing away from the house as the wind whipped around her. She had seen enough. The cries, the presence, it was all too much. But as Sarah walked away, she heard it. A soft cry. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, echoing in the night. It was coming from the house. She turned, her breath catching in her throat, but before she could move, the cry stopped abruptly. Sarah didn't look back. She couldn't. But one thing was certain: the house, the cries, and whatever was haunting her son were far from over. The dark truth. The revelation. Sarah had always known that there was something eerie about the house, but it wasn't until she sought out Mr. Richard, the old man who lived on the edge of the village, that the horrifying truth began to surface. Richard had lived in the village for most of his life and was well versed in its dark past. One evening, as Sarah sipped tea in his cluttered sitting room, she finally mustered the courage to ask him about the abandoned house that had begun to torment her thoughts. "Mr. Richard," Sarah began, her voice trembling slightly, "can you tell me anything about the house at the end of the road? The one that used to belong to the Edwards?" Richard sighed deeply, the weight of years pressing down on him as his weathered eyes stared into the distance, as if reliving a painful memory. "That house," he began slowly, "used to belong to Edward and Isabella Edwards. A good family, or so people thought. But everything changed one fateful night." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She had always suspected there was more to the house than met the eye, but hearing it spoken aloud made the reality more chilling than she had imagined. "Edward and Isabella," Richard continued, "had a daughter, Sophia. They lived quietly, but something wasn't right. There were whispers, rumors. People said that Edward was not the man he appeared to be. He was harsh, controlling, and over time, people began to notice strange things happening in that house." Sarah sat up straighter, hanging on every word. "What happened to them?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Richard's gaze darkened as he looked out the window, a shudder passing through him. "One night they vanished. No one knew where they went. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication they had left willingly. Just gone. People said they could hear crying from the house in the nights that followed, but no one dared to investigate. They just left the house, abandoned it, and never looked back." The revelation sent a chill through Sarah. She had thought the village was just quiet, perhaps even a bit too isolated, but now she realized it was hiding a much darker secret. Edward and Isabella's mysterious disappearance seemed to be at the heart of the strange occurrences in her home, and she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that the cries Billy had been hearing were connected to them. "Why didn't anyone search for them?" Sarah asked, her voice thick with disbelief. Richard shook his head gravely. "The villagers were scared. Edward was well-liked, but some said his behavior had become erratic, even dangerous. People were afraid of what they might find. They never questioned his version of the story. He said Isabella and Sophia had run off, but no one ever believed him. That house became a ghost of its former self, standing there, forgotten by most, but never truly abandoned in the eyes of those who remembered." Sarah felt her heart sink. There was something deeply sinister lurking in the walls of that house, and now she was tangled up in its web. The house had become a prison, not just for her, but for the ghosts of the past that still haunted it. The unspoken horror. Despite the dark stories she had heard from Richard, Sarah couldn't bring herself to leave. Billy's strange behavior, his insistence that he heard crying from the abandoned house, made it impossible for her to ignore the pull of the truth. She decided to investigate further, determined to uncover the secrets hidden within the house's decaying walls. As Sarah dug deeper, she discovered more unsettling details about the Edwards family. In the months leading up to their disappearance, Isabella had been acting strangely. Neighbors had noticed bruises on her arms, and Sophia, her daughter, had become withdrawn. It seemed that Edward's temper had reached a boiling point, and rumors of abuse began to surface. But no one spoke up. No one intervened. Then, as Sarah pieced together more of the village's history, she uncovered the most chilling discovery of all. Isabella and her daughter hadn't run away. They hadn't vanished on their own. Edward had killed them. The truth was buried in the basement of the house, in a room no one knew about, a room where Isabella and Sophia's bodies had been hidden. The more Sarah learned, the more it became clear that the house was not just haunted by the spirits of those who had died there. It was cursed. Isabella's soul had been trapped, unable to rest, forever mourning the loss of her daughter and the violence she had endured at the hands of her husband. The spirit of Sophia, too, lingered in the shadows, her innocence forever tainted by the horrors she had witnessed. As Sarah began to piece together these horrifying facts, she noticed the effects on Billy. His behavior had become even more erratic. He would stand by the window, whispering things she couldn't understand. And then one night, he said something that froze her blood. "She's here," Billy whispered, his voice trembling. "She wants to play with me." Sarah rushed to his side, her heart racing in her chest. "Who, Billy?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. "The lady in the window," Billy said, pointing towards the abandoned house. "She's crying. She wants to come inside." Sarah's heart stopped. The connection between the crying and the ghostly figure was undeniable. Billy wasn't just hearing the cries. He was seeing the spirit of Isabella, or perhaps both her and her daughter. The house had become a portal, a threshold between the living and the dead, and Billy had become the unwitting bridge. As Sarah stood there, paralyzed with fear, she knew she had to confront the truth. The house was calling to her. It was calling to her son. And now, she could no longer ignore it. Confronting the darkness. The final confrontation. The night was thick with fog as Sarah stood in front of the abandoned house once again. She had come to confront the darkness, to face whatever horrors had been left behind. The air was heavy with anticipation, the stillness of the night pressing in on her. She had never felt so alone, yet she knew that this was the only way to end it. The restless spirits of Isabella and Sophia would not be at peace until she uncovered the truth and set them free. With a trembling hand, Sarah reached for the doorknob and pushed the heavy door open. It creaked in protest, the sound echoing through the silence of the house. Inside, the air was musty, thick with the smell of decay. The floorboards creaked beneath her weight as she moved cautiously through the house, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. As Sarah entered the living room, the air grew colder. She could feel the presence of someone, watching her. The temperature dropped even further, and she could hear the faint sound of crying again, coming from somewhere deep within the house. The wails were haunting, heart-wrenching, and unmistakable. Isabella's spirit was here, and it was not alone. Sarah walked towards the source of the sound, her steps slow and deliberate. The walls seemed to close in on her, the darkness pressing against her from all sides. She had come to face the truth, but now, as she stood on the threshold of the basement door, she felt a surge of fear. But there was no turning back. Breaking the curse. With the help of Mr. Richard, Sarah had learned that the only way to release the spirits and end the curse was to perform an ancient ritual. The ritual would require her to enter the basement, confront the ghosts of Isabella and Sophia, and acknowledge the horrors they had suffered. But the ritual was not without its dangers. It would require not just courage, but a willingness to face her own demons. Sarah descended into the basement, her heart pounding in her chest. The cries grew louder, the presence of the spirits overwhelming. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, the air grew thick with tension. She could feel Isabella's presence before she even saw her, the sorrow and rage that had been trapped in this house for so long. Sarah took a deep breath, the cold air biting at her skin. She closed her eyes and whispered the words she had been taught, calling on the spirits to hear her. "Isabella, Sophia, I am here to free you. I will not let your pain continue." The room fell silent, and for a moment, Sarah thought she had failed. But then the air shifted. A soft breeze blew through the basement, and Sarah felt a presence, no longer hostile, but sorrowful. The wails of Isabella and Sophia had stopped. With trembling hands, Sarah reached for the pendant that hung around her neck. It was a symbol of hope, a symbol of the promise she had made to her son. She knew that the curse had been broken. The spirits had been set free. And in that moment, Sarah felt a sense of peace, a calmness she had never known before. She had faced the darkness and survived. The house, now quiet, had finally been released from the grip of the past. As she left the house for the last time, she looked back once more. The village, the house, and the memories would always remain, but they no longer held power over her. She had faced the darkness, and now it was time to move on. The spirits were finally at rest, and so too was she. The return of the forgotten. The return of the lost souls. After Sarah had successfully freed Isabella's spirit, she hoped that her troubles would finally end. The strange occurrences that once haunted the house had begun to subside. The whispers, the cold drafts, and the eerie wails seemed to vanish as though they had never existed. The house, once filled with dark energy, now felt more like a silent tomb than a living presence. But even though the house seemed peaceful again, Sarah could still feel the pull. There was an eerie connection that lingered between her and the house, a thread that seemed to tie her to the memories of the past. No matter how much she tried to move on, those memories refused to let go. Sarah was no longer living in the house, having made the decision to start anew. She rented a small cottage on the edge of the village, where she hoped to escape the ghosts of her past. She had told herself that it was time to leave the darkness behind, to finally find peace for herself and her son, Billy. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. The memories of the house and the spirits she had encountered still lingered in her mind. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, seemed to remind her of the haunting past. Despite the change in her surroundings, Sarah could not shake the feeling that something from the house was still watching her. At night, she sometimes woke with a start, as if she were being watched by unseen eyes. It was as if the house itself had become a part of her, a silent shadow that would forever remain attached to her soul. Billy, too, had changed. He no longer seemed to speak of the crying woman in the window, but Sarah could sense his unease. He had become quieter, more withdrawn, as if the events of the past had left an indelible mark on his innocent heart. Sarah tried her best to reassure him, to convince herself that everything was normal, but deep down, she knew that the past was never truly gone. The house, with its twisted history, had become a part of her life in ways that she could not explain. No matter how far she ran, the echoes of the past continued to haunt her, and she began to wonder if the house had left something behind, a lingering force, a curse that she could never truly escape. The hidden power. As Sarah tried to rebuild her life, strange things continued to occur. At night, when the wind howled through the trees, she sometimes felt a pressure in her chest, as if something was pushing against her, holding her in place. She would often catch glimpses of shadows moving in the corners of her vision, but when she turned to look, nothing was there. Her once peaceful home now felt like a prison, a cage that kept her locked within its walls. In the village, whispers began to spread again, and Sarah overheard rumors about the house. Some claimed that the house still had power, that it could never truly be free of the spirits it had trapped within. Sarah dismissed these as just stories, but a gnawing fear began to grow inside her. The house had already taken so much from her, and she realized that it was not just the spirits of Isabella and Sophia that lingered within its walls. It was something far more sinister. One evening, while walking through the village, Sarah met a stranger who claimed to know something about the house. The stranger, a woman named Claire, was an outsider who had recently moved to the village. She was quiet and reserved, but Sarah found herself drawn to her. Claire had heard the stories of the house, and she knew more than Sarah could have imagined. "Do you believe in the power of places?" Claire asked one evening as they sat in Sarah's cottage. "I mean places that hold on to things that they shouldn't let go of." Sarah was taken aback by the question, but she couldn't deny the truth of it. "I don't know," she said quietly, her eyes darkened with memories of the house. "But I've lived in that house. I've felt its power, its pull. I can't explain it, but it's as though the house itself has a life of its own, and I fear that I might never escape it." Claire nodded gravely. "There's something dark about that place, something that's tied to the land itself. It's not just the spirits of the dead. There's a power beneath the house, an energy that feeds off fear and loss. And it's that power that you're connected to." Sarah shivered. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that the house is more than just haunted. It's cursed, and whatever is in that house isn't finished. It's still waiting, and it's calling you back." Sarah's blood ran cold at Claire's words. She had never wanted to go back, but something inside her stirred, a deep compulsion to return, to face whatever it was that still lingered in the house. Secrets unveiled, the hidden truth. Despite the warning signs, Sarah found herself returning to the abandoned house. This time, she couldn't ignore the pull any longer. The feeling was overwhelming, like a weight pressing against her chest. She had to face what had been left behind. She had to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it was. It was late in the evening when she arrived, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the house. The air was thick with tension, and Sarah could feel the oppressive weight of the house's history pressing down on her as she stepped onto the property. The wind howled, but the house stood silent, as if waiting for her to enter. Inside, everything seemed just as she remembered: cold, empty, and full of sorrow. The familiar creaks of the floorboards, the sound of the wind rattling the windows, it all felt hauntingly familiar. But this time, Sarah was no longer afraid. She was determined to uncover the secrets that the house had been hiding for so long. As Sarah explored the house, she made her way down to the basement. This was the place where she had first encountered Isabella's spirit, where the truth had been hidden for so long. But there was something new, something that Sarah hadn't noticed before. In the farthest corner of the basement, there was a hidden door. It was small and hidden beneath layers of dust, but Sarah knew that this was where the answers lay. With trembling hands, she reached for the door and pulled it open. The room beyond was small, and it smelled of mildew and decay. On the walls, Sarah found something that made her heart stop: a series of drawings, some crude and others more detailed. They were drawings of Isabella and Sophia, but they weren't just portraits. They depicted scenes of torment, of suffering, of pain. Isabella had drawn these images herself, capturing the horror she had endured at the hands of her husband. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she examined the drawings. They were more than just images. They were a record of a life of abuse, a record of a woman's fight to survive in a house that had become her prison. And then, in the corner of one of the drawings, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A figure, a dark shadow, standing behind Isabella and Sophia. It was a figure she recognized, the same shadow that had appeared in her dreams. This was the true horror of the house. It wasn't just the ghosts of Isabella and Sophia. It was something far darker, something that had been lurking in the shadows all along. And now, it was coming for her. The sacrifice. Sarah knew that she had to act fast. The power of the house was growing stronger, and she could feel it tightening around her. The spirits of Isabella and Sophia may have been freed, but something far more dangerous was still present. She could sense it now, as if the very walls of the house were alive, watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. As Sarah sat in the basement, surrounded by the drawings, she began to piece together the true history of the house. It wasn't just a house of ghosts, it was a place where dark forces had taken root. Isabella's struggle for survival had not just been against her cruel husband, but against something far more powerful, an ancient force that had been bound to the land itself. The more Sarah uncovered, the more she realized that she would have to make a sacrifice to break the curse once and for all. The house would never be free unless she was willing to pay the ultimate price. But what was the price? What would she have to give up to ensure that the house's power would be broken forever? As Sarah stood at the crossroads, the wind howling through the cracks in the walls, she realized that there was no easy answer. The house had already taken so much from her, but now it wanted more. The only way to stop it was to confront the darkness head-on and make the ultimate sacrifice. With a heavy heart, Sarah made her decision. She would end the curse, but it would cost her everything. The final choice. Facing the ultimate fear. Sarah had lived in that house for what felt like an eternity, fighting against the oppressive forces that lingered in the shadows. She had faced ghosts, witnessed unnatural horrors, and uncovered dark secrets that no one should ever know. But nothing could have prepared her for the terrifying truth she would soon have to confront. The house was not merely haunted. It was a portal, a doorway between the living world and something far darker. It wasn't just the restless souls of Isabella and Sophia that lingered in the house. It was the malevolent presence of creatures from another realm. Edward, Isabella's cruel husband, had unwittingly opened the gates to this supernatural world when he brought an ancient curse into the house. The creatures that now roamed freely inside its decaying walls were born of the darkness beyond the veil, and they had no intention of leaving. Sarah had long suspected that there was more to the house than met the eye, but she had no idea just how deeply it was connected to a realm that existed beyond her comprehension. As she continued to stay in the village, the strange occurrences seemed to follow her, as though the darkness had found a way to seep into her own life. The sinister energy she had once fought so hard to escape now felt all-consuming. Sarah could no longer tell where the boundaries between the world she knew and the terrifying unknown began and ended. Every night, the house would call to her, its whispering shadows growing louder, and Sarah would find herself drawn back to it. The spirits of Isabella and Sophia were not the only ones trying to reach her. There were others, creatures, entities, beings from a realm of pure malevolence, waiting to break free. They were angry, they were hungry, and Sarah was the one who had unwittingly become their target. But the true horror didn't just lie in the supernatural forces that ravaged the house. It also lay within Sarah herself. The house had begun to manipulate her mind. As the malevolent forces grew stronger, Sarah's grip on reality began to slip. She started to feel as though her thoughts were no longer her own. The house was pulling her deeper into its thrall, using her darkest fears and regrets against her. Sarah realized that she was not merely battling against ghosts. She was fighting against the very core of her being, her sanity, and her own soul. Her fears of loss, betrayal, and the past that she could never escape were now being twisted and magnified by the malevolent presence. Sarah found herself questioning everything: her memories, her relationship with Billy, and her own sense of self. She was trapped in an unending nightmare, her reality dissolving into the suffocating darkness that surrounded her. The moment of decision. With the realization that the forces in the house were beyond her control, Sarah found herself at crossroads. She had done everything she could to protect Billy, to keep him safe from the horrors that had plagued her life. But now, she had to face an impossible decision. Would she sacrifice herself to ensure Billy's safety, or would she choose to leave the house forever, leaving it behind, and in doing so, risk everything? The weight of the decision was overwhelming. Sarah knew that if she stayed in the house and tried to destroy the evil forces once and for all, she might never leave. The house had already taken so much from her, and now it demanded a final sacrifice. The entities that dwelled in the house were stronger than anything Sarah had ever faced before. They wanted her, and they would stop at nothing to drag her into the darkness. If she chose to confront them, there was no guarantee she would survive. But if she left, the darkness would continue to fester, and it could take Billy with it. Sarah's heart ached at the thought of leaving the house and abandoning everything she had fought for. She couldn't bear to think of Billy growing up without a mother. But she also knew that she could not allow the evil to claim him. She couldn't allow the darkness to consume him, as it had consumed so many others. In the quiet of the night, Sarah stood at the threshold of the house once more, staring into the abyss that had haunted her for so long. The house was alive, with its whispers calling her name, urging her to step forward. But Sarah knew that this time, she couldn't let herself be consumed by the darkness. She had to make the ultimate choice. The only way to break the curse, to ensure Billy's safety, was for Sarah to confront the darkness head-on. She knew she had to face the creatures, to destroy the power that had corrupted the house. She had no choice but to walk into the heart of the house and battle the malevolent force that had taken root there. It was the only way to truly free herself and her son from the nightmare. But Sarah knew that her decision would come with a price. The house would demand a sacrifice, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to pay it. Her life, her soul, her very being, everything would be on the line. New beginnings, the end of the nightmare. The night Sarah stepped into the heart of the house, She knew it would be the final battle. The air was thick with tension, the house seeming to pulse with malevolent energy. The walls seemed to close in on her as she walked through the darkened halls, each step leading her deeper into the heart of the nightmare. She had faced the darkness before, but never like this. This time it was different. The house itself was fighting back, resisting her every move. As Sarah ventured further into the house, the spirits of Isabella and Sophia began to appear before her, their faces twisted with fear and sadness. They reached out to her, whispering words she couldn't understand, but their eyes held a deep sense of gratitude. Sarah realized that they had never been the true threat. It was the darkness, the malevolent forces that had taken hold of the house, that needed to be vanquished. The final confrontation came when Sarah entered the basement once more, the place where all the evil had been born. The creatures that had once been trapped within the house now swirled around her, their forms shifting in and out of existence, their eyes glowing with hunger. They were waiting for her, ready to drag her into the abyss. But Sarah was ready. She had faced her fears, her regrets, and the darkness within herself. She knew that she could not let this evil continue. She had to end it. With a deep breath, Sarah called upon all the strength she had left and confronted the darkness. She didn't know if she would survive, but she knew she had to try. With a single, decisive motion, Sarah shattered the heart of the house. The darkness recoiled, shrieking in fury as the house began to crumble around her. The creatures were vanquished, their power dissipating into the ether. The house, once a prison, began to fall into ruin, its foundation crumbling as the evil forces within it were extinguished. As the house collapsed, Sarah and Billy fled into the night, finally free from the nightmare that had haunted them for so long. The world outside was still, the air fresh and clear. Sarah looked down at Billy, his hand tightly clutching hers. They were free, and the nightmare, for the first time in years, was over. Reclaiming peace. After the battle, Sarah and Billy left the village, moving to a new town where they could start over. The house, the spirits, the creatures, it was all behind them. But despite their newfound peace, Sarah could never fully escape the memories of what they had been through. The darkness of the house had left an indelible mark on her soul, and she knew it would haunt her for the rest of her life. In their new home, Sarah began to rebuild, piece by piece, finding solace in the quiet moments with Billy. The village, the people, the horrors, everything was behind them. But as much as Sarah tried to move on, she knew that the truth of what had happened would never be forgotten. The house, and all the darkness that had lived within it, would forever be a part of her story. But there was one thing that Sarah knew for certain. She had won. She had conquered the darkness, and she had protected Billy. The nightmare was over, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt the warmth of peace, a peace that she had longed for, a peace that she had earned. And although the darkness would always linger in the corners of her mind, Sarah knew that she could move forward. She had triumphed over the forces that had tried to destroy her, and she had found the strength to embrace a new beginning. Reflections. The aftermath. In the aftermath of their ordeal, Sarah found herself grappling with the psychological consequences of the horrors she had witnessed. The house, despite being left behind, seemed to continue haunting her in ways she couldn't escape. The dark presence that had once filled the house now lingered within her mind, following her even into her new life. It was as if the house had imprinted its terror on her soul, leaving behind a trail of memories too vivid to forget. Every creak in the floor, every shadow in the corner of her vision, reminded her of the horrors she had faced. Sarah started attending therapy, hoping that talking about her experiences would help her reclaim some semblance of peace. But no matter how much she tried to talk about it, the darkness of the house seemed to always return. The images of Isabella and Sophia, the whispers in the walls, and the feeling of being watched, they all plagued her thoughts, even in the moments when she tried to relax. The fear that she was still being observed by something unseen weighed heavily on her heart. Billy, too, had his own struggles. The nightmares that haunted him began to resurface in the dead of night. He would wake up, drenched in sweat, screaming about the shadows in the house and the voices he had heard. While Sarah had tried to protect him from the horrors of the old house, it seemed that the scars left behind were far deeper than either of them had realized. Billy's once joyful and carefree nature had been replaced with a wariness that came from facing things no child should have to comprehend. One night, Billy woke up and whispered, "She's still crying, Mommy." His wide eyes, filled with fear, reminded Sarah that, despite their escape, they were not yet free from the house's hold. She tried to comfort him, but her own doubts and fears crept into her thoughts. What if they had truly never left the dark clutches of that place? Despite the progress she had made, Sarah couldn't help but feel that there was still something lingering between them and the safety they had longed for. The house's legacy wasn't just in the memories of the horrors they had endured, but in the psychological toll it had taken on both of them. Sarah knew that it would take time to heal, but part of her feared that she and Billy might never truly be rid of the trauma the house had caused. The lessons learned. In the quiet moments of reflection, Sarah began to understand the true nature of her struggle. It wasn't just about fighting against external forces. It was about battling the darkness inside herself. The house had forced her to confront her deepest fears and regrets, and it was these emotional wounds that had left scars she didn't know how to heal. Sarah realized that strength wasn't about never being afraid. It was about finding the courage to rise after every fall. She had fought through unimaginable horrors, but the real battle was within. In the midst of the darkness, she had learned that healing came from accepting what had happened, not denying it. She understood now that the key to overcoming fear wasn't about eradicating it entirely, but about learning to coexist with it. For Sarah, the hardest part was coming to terms with the fact that the house had been a reflection of her own hidden fears. The demons that had lived in that house were merely manifestations of the anguish she had buried deep within herself, the loss of her former life, the betrayal of her past, and the guilt she carried for not being able to protect Billy from the darkness. Despite the lingering scars, Sarah found solace in the lessons she had learned. She discovered that her own resilience was greater than any evil force. She began to realize that it wasn't the house that had held her captive, it was the fear and shame she had allowed to control her life. Sarah now understood that true healing came from embracing the lessons of the past and using them to fuel the future. The love she had for Billy, her determination to protect him, and the strength she had found within herself became her guiding light. She and Billy had survived the house, but more importantly, they had survived the darkness within themselves. The house no longer had power over them. Sarah had reclaimed her life, and she was ready to move forward. The eternal echo. A new dawn. After months of anxiety and uncertainty, Sarah and Billy began to feel the stirrings of peace in their new life. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. The nights that had once been filled with terror and nightmares were now quieter. Sarah began to see a new light, one that illuminated not just her physical surroundings, but also her soul. It was a light that promised healing, a light that promised hope. The house that had once been a source of fear now seemed distant, as though it belonged to someone else's story. Sarah no longer looked back with dread, but with a quiet understanding. She had survived, and in doing so, she had reclaimed her life. She no longer feared the memories of the house, because she had found the strength to overcome them. For the first time in a long time, Sarah and Billy could look forward to the future without being haunted by the past. They spent their days in the small, quiet village, finding joy in the simple moments, shared smiles, the warmth of the sun on their skin, and the comforting sound of laughter in their home. These were the moments that made life worth living. In the stillness of the mornings, Sarah found herself writing. She began crafting the story of her journey, of the horror she had faced, the courage she had found, and the love that had carried her through. Her words were not just an attempt to make sense of the past, but a way of sharing her experience with the world. She wanted others to understand that even in the darkest of times, there was always the possibility of light. It was this new beginning that gave Sarah hope. She had faced the unimaginable and come out stronger for it. The horrors of the past would never completely fade, but they would no longer define her. Her journey was far from over, but she had found the strength to walk it with her head held high. The legacy of the haunted house. Though Sarah had found peace in her new life, the legacy of the haunted house would never truly leave her. It had been a chapter in her story, one she could never forget, but one she could learn from. The ghosts of Isabella and Sophia, the memories of the darkness that had consumed her, would remain in the back of her mind, reminders of how far she had come and how much strength she had found. But Sarah no longer feared these memories. She knew they were a part of her, but they did not define who she was. The house had once been a symbol of everything that could go wrong in her life, but now it symbolized her resilience and her ability to face the unknown. Sarah's journey had taught her that sometimes the greatest battles were fought not with external forces, but within oneself. The true challenge was to overcome the fears that held you back, to break free from the chains of the past, and to embrace the present with an open heart. For Sarah, the haunted house had been both a curse and a blessing. It had pushed her to her limits, but had also shown her the depths of her own strength. As Sarah and Billy moved forward, they carried the lessons of the past with them, using them as the foundation for their future. The haunted house would always be a part of their story, but it no longer had any power over them. They had found peace, and they had found each other. The legacy of the house and the lives of Isabella and Sophia would continue to echo in Sarah's heart. Their story was a reminder that even in the face of darkness, there was always the possibility of light. And that was a lesson Sarah would carry with her for the rest of her life. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe to Stories TH for more chilling tales. Your support helps us continue bringing you stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. Stay tuned for our next mystery. And remember, sometimes the darkest secrets are hidden in the places we least expect.